Welcome. Today we're going to be doing an exploration of a film that was, well, so much more than just a film when it came out. We're talking about Forrest Gump.
That's right. And when you think about it, this movie landed in 1994, and it wasn't just a hit. It became a genuine phenomenon.
A cultural touchstone, really. It spanned decades of American history, all seen through the eyes of this one improbable life.
Which is why we're going to do something a little different today. We're deliberately setting aside the step-by-step plot.
Because everyone knows the story, the broad strokes. Run, Forrest, run, the box of chocolates.
Exactly. So instead, we're going to focus on all the other elements, the things that really elevated this film beyond just its story.
Okay, so what are we looking at?
We're going beneath the surface. We'll look at the revolutionary technology it pioneered, the really complex and sometimes controversial changes from the original novel.
And the casting, of course.
The casting choices that defined careers? Absolutely. And then there's the intense political symbolism that made it such a lightning rod for debate. And it still resonates today, 3 decades later.
So our mission, really, is to understand how this film went from being just an adaptation of Winston Groom's 1986 novel to becoming this undeniable piece of American cultural history.
It's an exploration of memory, of technology, and of ideology.
And just for context, for anyone who needs a refresher, it was released in July of '94, directed by Robert Zemeckis, screenplay by Eric Roth.
And it was a colossal success right out of the gate,
Colossal is the word. It won 6 Academy Awards.
including Best Picture and Best Actor for Tom Hanks.
And it grossed over $678 million worldwide, all on a $55 million budget?
A pretty modest budget by today's standards. And, all those things, the technical achievements, the commercial success, the social interpretation, that's what led to it being preserved by the Library of Congress.
Which is a huge deal.
It is. So to really appreciate that impact, I think we have to start with the human element. Specifically, the casting decisions and how the film's characters were so sharply and often controversially changed from the book.
Okay, let's unpack that. That point about the casting is crucial, and you have to start with the title role. I mean, the film's success rests so squarely on Tom Hanks's shoulders.
It really does. And it's fascinating how quickly he committed. The sources say he signed on after reading the script for only about an hour and a half.
An hour and a half. That suggests such an immediate connection with Eric Roth's version of the character.
That immediate buy-in was clearly pivotal, but the preparation he did, that highlights the level of detail that went into the performance.
You're talking about the voice.
I'm talking about the voice.
Oh.
The origin of Forrest's distinctive voice is one of those great production anecdotes. He didn't just invent a generic Southern accent.
No, he specifically incorporated the unique Southern accented drawl of Michael Connor Humphreys.
The young actor who played Gump as a child.
Yeah, and that decision ensures there's this seamless vocal continuity. It really grounds the character's voice in his childhood.
It's a brilliant detail. But that detail about the accent, it kind of speaks to the much deeper creative decision they made, which was to completely reshape the character himself.
Especially when you contrast him with the Gump from the original novel.
Right. This is where the adaptation becomes radical.
How so?
Well, director Robert Zemeckis was very open about this. He noted they departed from the book substantially. In Winston Groom's novel, Forrest Gump was. He was anything but simple.
He was actually much closer to a savant figure, wasn't he?
That's the perfect word for it. The book describes him getting a perfect score in an advanced physics class.
Which was a requirement from his football coach, of all things.
Right. And at the same time, he's feeling subjects that most people find straightforward, like craft and gym. He had these highly specific, almost otherworldly talents.
So the book's Gump wasn't just sort of passively drifting through history. He was actively, sometimes cynically, manipulating things or just succeeding wildly because of these specialized skills.
Exactly. And the novel's version of Forrest had a much more fantastic, almost surreal trajectory. It bordered on the absurd, really.
Like what other paths did he take in the book?
Well, for one, he becomes an astronaut and goes to space with an ape.
Okay.
He was also a professional wrestler called the Masked Marvel and a world-class chess player. The film, as Zemeckis put it flipped the two elements.
So what did they flip, exactly?
They made the love story between Forrest and Jenny the primary focus. That became the emotional anchor of the film.
And all those fantastic adventures.
They became secondary. Or they were tailored, like the ping pong, to fit into the historical events that Forrest intersects with.
And maybe most crucially, they sanitized his character.
Completely. They made him what they called a completely decent character, always true to his word. They stripped away all the book's harsher edges.
Including Forrest's own moments of cynicism or even accidental cruelty that are in the novel?
Right, and you have to ask, did that decision making him purely decent? Did that set the stage for the political debates that the film would later spark?
It seems almost inevitable.
Absolutely, because by establishing Forrest as this inherently good, simple person guided by traditional values, the film creates this highly stable moral center.
And that stability then serves as this incredibly sharp contrast to the chaotic, often self-destructive path of the film's other central figure, Jenny Curran.
Portrayed so powerfully by Robin Wright.
That character evolution, it just throws Jenny's tragic arc into such sharp relief. She becomes the necessary emotional counterweight to Forrest's simplicity.
And Robin Wright's portrayal, it captures a character who is so deeply traumatized. It starts with her foundation as a victim of child sexual abuse at the hands of her widowed father.
The script is very clear about the deep, painful roots of her later self-destructive behaviors. It's a very sympathetic portrayal of that trauma.
Yes, and the source material details how her adult life is really a reaction to that. She becomes the embodiment of the excesses and the search for freedom associated with the 1960s counterculture.
She lives this volatile hippie lifestyle. She struggles profoundly with drug use and addiction.
And she engages in prostitution at various points. And this entire trajectory stands in stark contrast to Forrest's inherent goodness and stability.
So the narrative is really using her life path to explore the pitfalls and, as critics would later argue, to pass judgment on that entire era.
And then, of course, there's the emotional weight of her ultimate fate. She dies of an unknown, incurable virus.
And that detail alone generated so much discussion. The source material reveals a fascinating discrepancy here about the filmmaker's intent versus the novelist's original intention.
It's a point of really intense historical specificity. Winston Groom, the author, he intended for the illness to be hepatitis C.
Which at the time the novel was set, and when Groom was writing, it was often just called non-A, non-B hepatitis, right?
Or simply an unknown virus. It wasn't formally defined until April of 1989. So this fits the timeline and the context of Jenny's lifestyle perfectly.
But the implication in the film, and what some of the creators said later, it shifted the narrative focus.
It did. Some of the film's creative team, including the writer Eric Roth, have stated they intended the disease to be HIV/AIDS.
Which was critical because the film came out during a peak period of the AIDS crisis and awareness.
Exactly. So whether you read it as hepatitis C or HIV/AIDS, Jenny's death was ultimately designed to symbolize the demise of a certain way of life. A fact that, as we'll get into later, deeply factored into the film's political interpretation.
Okay, let's move to another essential character, one whose arc is just as central to the film's emotional success. Lieutenant Dan Taylor, played by Gary Sinise.
A phenomenal performance.
It is, and it's interesting that he wasn't the immediate first choice. High-profile actors like Joe Pesci and Kevin Bacon were considered for that role.
But Sinise's casting turned out to be definitive. And partly because his connection to the role was so personal, so rooted in empathy.
He drew direct inspiration from observing the struggles of Vietnam War veterans, didn't he?
He did. He specifically mentioned veterans within his wife's family who shared their experiences, the psychological toll they faced when they came home.
And his performance just taps into this incredibly complex emotional territory. Lieutenant Dan, he initially sees losing his legs as denying him his family's destiny.
Which is this fatalistic tradition of dying honorably in every single U.S. war since the Revolution.
And that loss leaves him so bitter, so antagonistic, full of resentment toward Forrest for saving him and leaving him what he initially calls a cripple.
And what's fascinating is that Sinise's portrayal doesn't rush you to acceptance. You're forced to witness the prolonged pain of a veteran struggling with his identity, with what he sees as failure.
It's a powerful statement on post-war recovery.
It is. And eventually, of course, they achieve that reconciliation. They build this phenomenal success with the Bubblegum Shrimp Company, and Lieutenant Dan finds peace.
He even finds physical recovery. He ends the film sporting magic legs.
Those advanced titanium alloy prosthetics. And he's engaged to his fiancée, Susan. It's a complete journey.
From total despair to a new version of the American dream, one far removed from his military destiny.
A powerful arc.
And while we're on these formative roles, we should probably pause on the tremendous amount of casting trivia that surrounds this film, starting with Benjamin Buford, Bubba Blue.
Right. McKelty Williamson's commitment to Bubba was physical as well as emotional. The sources confirm he wore that distinctive lip attachment throughout the entire filming.
To get Bubba's unique facial appearance, it really enhanced the character's memorable presence.
It really did.
And the near misses for the lead roles are just legendary. I mean, this could have been a very, very different movie.
Oh, completely. John Travolta was the original choice for Gump.
He famously passed on it, a decision he later called a profound mistake.
And you think about the ripple effect of that mistake. Hanks' success in this role cemented his place as America's everyman. But Travolta wasn't the only one.
No, Bill Murray, Chevy Chase, Matthew Broderick were all on the short list. Sean Penn even said later that he was the second choice for Forrest.
Imagine that. And for Bubba, there was similar competition. Actors like David Alan Grier and Ice Cube turned it down.
And maybe the most famous anecdote is Dave Chappelle, who also passed.
He later said he genuinely believed the film would be unsuccessful, a decision he was widely reported to have regretted once those box office numbers started coming in.
It just shows how a massive cultural phenomenon can depend on just a few critical decisions, both by the actors who say yes and the ones who say no.
It truly does. And we should also acknowledge Tom Hanks' own family connections in the film.
His younger brother, Jim Hanks.
Served as his acting double for all those lengthy cross-country running sequences.
And his daughter, Elizabeth Hanks, appeared as the girl on the school bus.
The one who pointedly refuses to let young Forrest sit next to her. A small but really memorable moment of childhood cruelty.
So we have this meticulously cast ensemble, and we have characters who are dramatically altered from their book origins to create this stable, emotional, and political core.
Right.
But none of this sprawling narrative across decades of American history, none of it would have been remotely convincing without the next major element, the technological breakthroughs that seamlessly embedded Forrest Gump into history itself.
This is where Forrest Gump really earned its place in the history books, the technological history books. This is why it became required viewing for visual effects studios across the globe.
The work done by Ken Ralston and his team at Industrial Light and Magic, ILM.
It set completely new standards for integrating actors into archival footage.
Yeah.
They essentially pioneered a kind of high-definition, believable, deepfake style of historical interaction.
Okay, so let's unpack the specific techniques here, because this was so much more than just simple cut-and-paste editing.
Oh, far beyond. They used a whole suite of complex CGI techniques to get that seamless integration.
We're talking about things like chroma key,
which is the technique of compositing two images together based on color hues, using blue or green screens. They also use image warping and morphing to subtly change the shape and appearance of the historical figures.
and rotoscoping.
And rotoscoping.
Yeah.
And for those who might not be familiar, rotoscoping is that painstaking frame-by-frame process of tracing actors or objects in live-action film.
To create mats, which lets you insert them cleanly into other footage.
Exactly. And the final goal was to make Tom Hanks look like he was genuinely, tangibly interacting with figures like JFK, Lyndon B. Johnson, and Richard Nixon.
So what was the process?
The sources detail it pretty meticulously. First, Hanks was filmed against a blue screen. He had reference markers, so his body position and his eye lines would perfectly align with the archival footage they were using.
But the biggest challenge wasn't just getting him in the shot, it was the dialogue. They had to interact, so the historical figures needed to say new lines.
And that's where the true technological wizardry came in. Because obviously they couldn't ask deceased presidents to record new lines.
So they used voice actors.
Voice actors provided the new dialogue. And then the special effects teams used technology to meticulously alter the lip syncing of the archival footage of Kennedy or Johnson to match that new dialogue.
That process was just so revolutionary and so believable. It really defined how filmmakers approached historical recreation for decades.
It really did. It makes you appreciate the sheer commitment to digital illusion required for a film made in 1994.
And it's also worth noting the one exception to this rule.
Dick Cavett.
Dick Cavett, the only well-known figure who actually played a de-aged version of himself using makeup rather than being inserted into archive footage. That was for his interview scene with Forrest and John Lennon.
A rare case of practical effects in a sea of digital innovation. And the VFX wasn't just limited to presidents and talk show hosts. Some of the most emotionally impactful scenes required huge digital modification.
You're talking about Lieutenant Dan's amputation.
Exactly. That was a completely unique challenge. The audience had to believe, without any distraction, that Gary Sinise had genuinely lost his legs.
That scene is so intense, and it's completely central to his emotional journey. So can you elaborate on the technical method they used? How did they pull that off?
The main method involved wrapping Gary Sinise's legs in blue fabric, a classic chroma key technique.
But the real labor came next.
Right. This is where the rotopaint team came in. And just for clarity, the rotopaint team is made up of digital artists who are tracing, masking, and essentially painting out elements frame by painstaking frame.
So they had to digitally erase his legs from every single frame where he appeared as a double amputee.
Every single one. That sounds like thousands of hours of incredibly precise digital artwork just for one character.
It was, and the precision required was just immense. The sources detail that in a later scene when Lieutenant Dan is hoisting himself into his wheelchair, you can actually briefly see the residual outline where his remaining legs are providing support.
Which shows you the complex technical layering involved. They had to maintain the physical reality of his weight and movement, even while they were digitally removing the visual evidence of his legs.
It's incredible. And beyond character effects, the film had to handle the massive scope of historical events. Specifically, that iconic peace rally scene at the Lincoln Memorial.
The scale of that crowd looks absolutely enormous. It looks like hundreds of thousands of people.
And that was achieved through this clever combination of logistics, planning, and early computer multiplication, an early form of digital crowd duplication.
They used about 1,500 real extras filmed over 2 days. And for each successive take, the production team would physically rearrange and move those extras into a different quadrant away from the camera.
So they're filming the same group of people multiple times in different spots and then digitally stitching all those layers together.
Precisely. Using computer multiplication, they then replicated and layered these separate shots to create the illusion of a crowd of several 100,000 people. This blending of real extras and CGI multiplication was a massive technical feat at the time.
It established a methodology that's still used today for filling large historical scenes.
It did. And the Vietnam sequence was equally complex, especially that terrifying moment when Forrest rescues Bubba from the napalm attack.
Amidst all that chaotic shelling.
That scene blended high-stakes stunts, meticulously controlled practical explosions, and CGI enhancements. They used stunt actors initially for compositing. Then Hanks and Williamson were filmed separately.
And Williamson was supported by a visible cable wire as Hanks ran with him?
Right. The explosions were filmed separately, and the actors were digitally inserted to look like they were just in front of them, increasing the sense of peril without actually putting them at risk.
And even details like the jet fighters and the napalm canisters.
All added by CGI.
It's remarkable how much technological lifting the film did while still feeling like such an emotional human story. And this focus on seamless illusion, it even extended to the physical locations. The film is set in Greenbow, Alabama, but we know most of it was shot elsewhere.
That's often the case. But the specific locations are worth noting. Principal photography was mainly in South Carolina, around Beaufort, Barnville, and Yemassee, as well as parts of coastal Virginia and North Carolina.
And the Gump House itself was a set.
It was. A physical set constructed along the Combahee River near Yemassee, South Carolina.
I also read that they actually altered the local ecology a bit for the Vietnam scenes.
They did. To enhance the look of the Vietnam jungle scenes, which were filmed at Hunting Island State Park, they planted over 20 palmetto trees. It just shows the dedication to visual realism, even when VFX were handling the explosions.
And finally, the most iconic location of all, the bus stop bench, where Forrest tells his entire life story.
The physical centerpiece of the whole film structure.
That was filmed at the northern edge of Chippewa Square in Savannah, Georgia.
And it's those specific real-world locations, Beaufort standing in for Alabama, that Savannah bench, that really ground the film, even as the visual effects are taking us across decades and around the world. It makes the fantastic elements just a little more palatable.
So now we shift from the nuts and bolts of production, from the artistry of the actors, to something much more contested, the ideological impact. Once this film was released and became a massive hit, why did it generate such intense debate over its political symbolism almost immediately?
This is such an important question, because officially, the creators themselves insisted the film was neutral.
Tom Hanks maintained it was non-political and thus non-judgmental.
And producer Steve Tisch said it was about humanity, respect, tolerance, and unconditional love. They really intended it to be universal.
But the sources clearly show that the film was just immediately absorbed into the American culture wars of the mid-1990s.
It was debated intensely on political commentary shows like CNN's Crossfire. The big question was whether it was secretly promoting conservative values or indicting the 1960s counterculture, or maybe just offering a simplified, nostalgic view of traumatic history.
And that intense debate, it stems from that fundamental contrast between the characters we detailed earlier.
Forrest as the simple, stable traditionalist versus Jenny as the chaotic, self-destructive liberal.
And the conservative reading gained significant traction. It was championed by commentators like Thomas Byers, who called it an aggressively conservative film.
Aggressively conservative. So how exactly did they argue that? What was the structure of that argument?
It hinged entirely on the moral outcome of the two main characters. Forrest's life, guided by his mother's traditional wisdom, is portrayed as honorable, successful, and fundamentally decent.
Whereas Jenny's life is a cascade of self-inflicted wounds, drug use, promiscuity, affiliation with the anti-war movements, all leading to her tragic and symbolic demise.
National Review even included it in its best conservative movies list. They argued that Gump was far too smart to embrace the lethal values of the 1960s.
So in that interpretation, the film is basically a morality play. The traditional American dream, rooted in stability and simple goodness, ultimately triumphs over the perceived excesses and moral relativism of the cultural revolutions of the 60s and 70s.
And commentators supporting that view pointed to the film's highly selective portrayal of history.
Right. Jennifer Highland Wang, who was a prominent critic of the film's politics, she argued that the film idealizes the 1950s. She specifically noted the lack of any visible whites-only signs or overt racial strife in Gump's Southern childhood.
A sanitized view of that decade that conveniently ignores the painful historical realities of the era.
And if the 1950s are presented as sanitized and innocent, what impact does that have on how the following decades are portrayed?
It makes the transition to the 1960s seem inherently more chaotic and confusing by comparison.
And Wang argues this contrast is intentional. It's designed to critique counterculture values and reaffirm a return to conservatism. She makes a compelling case that the screenplay deliberately transferred all of Gump's flaws and most of the excesses committed by Americans in the 1960s and 1970s onto Jenny.
Essentially using her as a scapegoat for the cultural sins of the era.
And in that context, Jenny's death from the unnamed virus becomes a powerful, even aggressive symbolic statement. It goes way beyond simple tragedy.
If you connect this to the broader political picture, Wang's analysis is that Jenny's death symbolizes the death of liberal America and the death of the protests that defined a decade.
An incredibly strong reading. And that ideological reading was powerful enough that Republican politicians at the time, like presidential candidate Bob Dole, they actively adopted the film's message.
Interpreting Gump as a success story that showed no matter how great the adversity, the American dream is within everybody's reach.
A message that perfectly supported their political platform.
It's so clear that the creator's intention of non-judgmental neutrality was just completely overwhelmed by the public's desire to find ideological meaning in this epic historical traversal.
And the film's most recognizable piece of visual symbolism, the feather, that also fueled this interpretive fire. It invited all these philosophical readings about destiny and free will.
The feather drifting randomly at the beginning and the end, it's the perfect ambiguous symbol.
It is. It invited people to project their own meanings onto it. Was it the randomness of experience? Or maybe Gump's impaired intellect? Or even the philosophical concept of the unbearable lightness of being?
A life free from the weight of high-minded political or intellectual burdens? What did the cast and crew themselves say about the feather?
The sources show a few different readings. Tom Hanks himself said the feather represented destiny, defined by how we choose to deal with the chance elements in life, the unpredictable things that land at our feet.
And Sally Field, who played Mama Gump.
She compared it directly to fate, asking the audience to question, was it planned or was it just perchance?
And Ken Ralston, the VFX supervisor, who actually created the feather's trajectory.
He just likened it to an abstract painting, meaning so many things to so many different people.
Its ambiguity is arguably its greatest strength. It allows both the conservative reading and the neutral reading to coexist.
Sure, but not all critics were enamored with this ambiguity, or with the character himself. There was a significant critical counterargument that dismissed the film as simplistic nostalgia.
Absolutely. Critics like Janet Maslin, she went further than just calling it sentimental.
She famously called Gump a hollow man.
Right. arguing he was so warmly embraced precisely because he embodied absolutely nothing. Maslin saw Gump as self-congratulatory in his blissful ignorance, which made the film's success problematic. It celebrated a lack of engagement with complex historical truths.
This sounds like the glamorized nostalgia argument.
It is. Critics like Bruce Cowan and Gerald Mast noted that Gump's dimness was a metaphor for this glamorized nostalgia. They suggested he was a blank slate.
So, by making Forrest simple and decent, the film allowed the baby boomer generation, its primary audience, to project a simplified, left traumatic memory onto the painful, conflicting historical events of the latter 20th century.
Gump simplifies the complex.
And that critique definitely gained traction over time. It led to a notable reevaluation of the film's merit. And the most telling sign of this critical shift happened years later.
That would be the 2015 poll of Academy members.
Right. When they were given a hypothetical second chance to vote for the 1994 Best Picture Oscar, they said they would have awarded it to The Shawshank Redemption instead.
Over Forrest Gump.
Which suggests that while the film was a massive commercial and initial award success, its critical standing dimmed over the decades in favor of a film perceived to have a deeper, more enduring cinematic quality.
But regardless of any ideological or critical debates, the sheer commercial power and its subsequent legacy are just undeniable. Let's review the film's massive economic and cultural footprint, starting with the box office. This film was a giant.
It was an immediate powerhouse. The film grossed over $8 million in its first 2 days alone, and it had a colossal opening weekend of over $24.4 million.
Which, at the time, set a record for Paramount's biggest non-holiday opening weekend.
And its dominance wasn't fleeting. It maintained incredible momentum throughout 1994.
For the first 12 weeks of its release, it stayed firmly in the top 3 at the U.S. box office, topping the list 5 separate times.
It initially lost the title of top-grossing film of 1994 to The Lion King. But after a reissue following its Oscar nominations, it regained the title.
Beating The Lion King to become the highest-grossing film of the year in the U.S. and Canada, it ultimately sold over 78.5 million tickets in its initial run. Just staggering numbers.
But despite that monumental revenue, over $678 million worldwide, this success leads us directly to that infamous successful failure accounting controversy.
Okay, so how does a film that grossed that much money supposedly end up in the red, according to the studio? We need to explain this clearly for the listener.
This is a textbook, though highly controversial, example of what's often called Hollywood accounting. The film was reportedly $62 million in the red, according to Paramount's internal figures, even with hundreds of millions in revenue.
So how does that happen? How do they make the net profit figure stay at 0 or below?
The calculation is designed to inflate costs, to minimize the share of profit that goes to anyone contracted for a percentage of the net profit.
So costs like distribution fees, which Paramount pay to itself.
Right. Advertising expenses, inflated overheads, all of that is deducted before any net profit is calculated. These deductions often ensure that while the film has grossed a fortune, the ledger for net profit always stays at 0 or in the negative.
And the major victim of this specialized accounting was the original author, Winston Groom.
Correct. Groom was contracted for a 3% share of the firm's net profits. And because of this strategic accounting, he was initially told the film had no net profit. So he didn't receive any payment from the film's initial success.
It's generated massive negative press for the studio. It really highlighted the inequity in Hollywood contracts.
It did. And you contrast this with the stars of the film. Tom Hanks and director Robert Zemeckis were clearly wiser, or at least had better representation.
They did. They had strategically contracted for a share of the gross receipts.
Instead of relying on a standard salary or a percentage of the unreliable net profit figure.
So their payments were calculated before all those inflated expenses were factored in.
And as a result, they each earned a staggering $40 million from the film's success. Groom eventually resolved his legal dispute, and he received a large contract for the rights to the sequel novel, Gump & Co.
Even though that sequel film was ultimately never made.
Never made.
And speaking of Gump & Co., it's intriguing that the sequel novel itself incorporated the real-life events of the first film's success right into Forrest's timeline.
Yes, the novel version of Forrest Gump runs into Tom Hanks and attends the Academy Awards. It just blurs the line between the fictional character and his real-world cultural impact.
But the film project was halted due to a world-altering event.
Right. The sources say Eric Roth had written a screenplay for the sequel in 2001. It was intended to start with Forrest dealing with his son having AIDS, a potent emotional core.
So why did the project stop?
Roth Zemeckis, and Hanks were scheduled to meet to discuss it on September 12, 2001. After the attacks on September 11th, they decided that the story, with its focus on historical traversals and specific contemporary issues, it was just no longer relevant in that profoundly changed cultural and political climate.
And the project was dropped indefinitely.
That's right.
Beyond the box office, the film's musical identity contributed enormously to its cultural footprint. It helped define that journey through American history.
The soundtrack, with its 32 songs, was a colossal commercial success. It sold over 12 million copies.
And the music was highly deliberate. It was carefully curated to support the film's historical themes.
The music producer, Joel Sill, confirmed that director Zemeckis insisted that all 32 songs featured had to be by American artists, spanning the 1950s to the 1980s.
So why the strict focus on American artists?
The choice was made because Zemeckis believed American music was the only kind of music that Forrest, given his simple tastes and background, would realistically buy or listen to.
So it helped ground the film in its chronological journey through American history.
Exactly. Featuring everyone from Elvis Presley and Bob Dylan to The Doors, Jimi Hendrix, and Lynyrd Skynyrd. It ensured the auditory experience matched the visual nostalgia.
And the film's accolades really solidify its status as a cultural touchstone that transcended just commercial success. We mentioned the 6 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, Director, and Actor.
It also secured 3 Golden Globes and 2 Saturn Awards. But its cultural significance is formally recognized by the highest American institutions.
The American Film Institute, the AFI?
They recognized its status by ranking the film 71st on its list of 100 years, 100 movies. And the film gave us one of the most quotable lines in cinematic history.
Mama always said life was like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get.
Which ranked 40th on the AFI's list of 100 movie quotes.
But maybe the most enduring accolade, and the one that really wraps up our entire conversation, is its selection for preservation in the National Film Registry in 2011.
And the criteria for that selection, it tells you precisely why this film matters beyond its initial release or its critical debates.
What's fascinating here is that the registry cited the film specifically for 2 major reasons.
First, for its technological innovations. That pioneering digital insertion of Gump seamlessly into vintage archival footage, acknowledging its lasting technical legacy.
And second,
it was cited for its resonance within the culture that has elevated Gump to the status of folk hero. They acknowledged its effort to engage both playfully and seriously with contentious aspects of the era's traumatic history.
that citation just perfectly encapsulates this entire exploration. The film is a monumental blend of technology, highly debatable ideological interpretation, and a character that, despite being digitally inserted and dramatically simplified from the book, captured the American public's imagination.
And finally, we should note its enduring global legacy, including the official authorized Indian remake.
Right, Lal Singh Chaddha, released in 2022.
Starring Amir Khan. And it adapts the storyline to events in India between the late 1970s and 2010s. Lal Singh traverses events like the emergency and the Kargil War.
Which really shows how the core themes of the narrative, the simple, innocent character witnessing history unfold, are globally relatable, regardless of the specific historical context.
We've covered everything from Tom Hanks' use of a child actor's accent, to the ethical debates around Hollywood accounting, and the groundbreaking digital erasure of Gary Sinise's legs. This whole exploration just shows that Forrest Gump is far more than a sweet story about a simple man.
It's a complex narrative artifact from 1994. It reflects these deeply held and often conflicting beliefs about American innocence, political change, and technical mastery.
And what stands out now after reviewing all this is how successfully the film used those groundbreaking visual effects to create what the National Film Registry called an elevation of Gump to the status of a folk hero. We've discussed all the controversial interpretations, the critique of the counterculture, the idealization of the past, the deliberate changes from the cynical original novel, and the intense labor that went into making him a credible witness.
So, considering all of this, what does Forrest Gump ultimately represent about the American memory of the latter 20th century? Does he simplify history for comfort, or does his journey genuinely help the audience reckon with a traumatic past?
And that is a final thought for you, the listener, to consider.
Thanks for listening.